Afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Maggie Livingston. I'm the faculty director of the DePaul Center for Animal Law, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation on community cats and puppy millers by our featured speaker, San Diego attorney Bryan Pease. Before we get into the presentation, thank a couple of people. First, Brett Harrison Davinger, who is associate director for the DePaul Center for Animal Law, who was instrumental in putting this program together. And also Ken Kniff and the International Institute for Animal Law, who have been our longtime and faithful supporters and are co-sponsoring the program today. So now I would like to introduce Bryan Pease. He's a nationally recognized civil rights, environmental law, and an animal protection attorney based in San Diego and licensed in California and New York. Bryan's nationwide undercover investigations and lawsuits against factory farm cruelty have been featured in the national bestseller, The Foie Gras Wars by Chicago Tribune reporter Mark Caro. Bryan's multiple suits against the city of San Diego saved a Treasure Harbor seal colony from having the beach where they give birth and nurse their pups destroyed. He is co-founder and the volunteer executive director of the Animal Protection and Rescue League, an international nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the rights and habitats of all animals. Bryan has taught animal law at Cal Western School of Law and frequently guest lectures in animal law classes in California and New York. Welcome, Bryan. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So, we're going to be talking about a few different topics today, and they're somewhat related, but the title of the presentation, Cats and Puppy Millers, has to do with two specific cases here in San Diego, one involving an issue that also touched on matters that were happening in Chicago and Illinois around the same time. In 2019, 2020, there were puppy stores that were evading local laws that had been passed regarding the sale of non-rescue dogs, cats, and rabbits in pet stores. And so what a handful of the puppy stores did here was simply relabel the puppies as being quote unquote rescues, and then just continued the exact same business model. And we saw a similar thing happen in Chicago. Ultimately, there were some legislative changes that were made to make enforcement easier and to stop that from happening. So I'm going to be talking about some cases that I brought here regarding that, and then separately, there's the issue with community cats, which I know has generated a lot of interest because there's, of course, a long history of beneficial trap, neuter, release programs for feral cats and managing feral cat colonies, and nobody wants to have feral cats confined in shelters, but at the same time, we're now seeing a shift to friendly, adoptable cats, and in many cases, stray and abandoned cats, and cats that were recently belonged to somebody that were either dumped or they're lost, ending up being re-abandoned by animal control agencies that are following what's being pushed by certain elements as a new model of not considering whether a cat is friendly or feral and simply treating all cats that are found outdoors, except for specific exceptions, as being quote unquote community cats. And then there's an issue whether that was legal or not. So I'm one attorney here in San Diego working on these issues, and I'll mention a couple other animal rights cases I brought as well, and how those intersect with these cases and some of the larger issues. But I'm a solo practice attorney. My firm is Pease and Ejeti. The Ejeti stands as my spouse is Parisa Ejeti Maksudi, who recently, my firm was called Pease Law, and then Parisa joined my firm about a year ago, or a couple years ago, but more recently became the director of California policy for the National Housing Law Project. So we still bounce ideas off each other. We have a few cases through the firm, housing policy cases that we're still able to work on as counsel on the same case. But for the most part, I'm now doing these cases, back to doing these cases as a solo practitioner, which gives me a little bit of, it gives me quite a bit of flexibility. And often I'm going up against large law firms that have teams of attorneys that are defending these cases. And it gives me a little bit more flexibility and ability to act quickly in some of these cases by being a small firm or acting on my own. So I've been able to bring cases that we're not seeing some of the larger groups that are out there that have resources bring cases. In some cases are bringing similar type cases. But the types of cases that I focus on in California take advantage of specific laws that we have here. So we have, for instance, a strong anti-SLAPP law, which is strategic litigation against public participation. And that enables me to defend activists' free speech rights. So, and it also has very powerful fee shifting. So if somebody's sued for free speech for exposing something that's, if actually we see this with veterinary malpractice. I've brought a few cases. Folks on this CLE are probably, if you're involved in animal law, you probably hear get a lot of case referrals about veterinary malpractice, and those cases are hard to bring. And there's an issue of how can you even recover enough damages to make the case worthwhile. But if the victim is posting something or trying to warn other consumers about the veterinary malpractice and then gets sued by the vet or the vet practice, then you've got an anti-SLAPP case, and you can require them to pay attorney's fees, and you can protect the person's free speech rights. So sometimes civil rights and free speech and all of these issues intersect with animal law and environmental protection, which is another area of law that I practiced in. So jumping right into first the puppy. There were several of these puppy mill cases. So what happened? I'll actually now share part of my screen here. Initially, when this started happening in California, we filed suit, and also, I want to give a shout out to John Marr, who's an attorney in New York, who has worked on a lot of these cases with me. And then you see Parisa on the caption of this one as well. And this is the federal case that we brought on behalf of the Real Pet Connect Rescue, which is a Maryland corporation. And what happened was these puppy millers were using, and David Salinas, the defendant here, is he is the owner. He was the owner of the California pet stores. He has since moved to Utah and Nevada and is continuing to run puppy stores out there. So initially, when he was selling these puppies in California and claiming that they were rescues, we filed in state court. I was able to get preliminary injunctions stopping the unlawful sales. And then after the fact, after that we had ended the unlawful scheme, there was still this issue of the fact that they had sold thousands of puppies under the name Pet Connect Rescue for thousands of dollars each. So really millions of dollars in wrongful profits. And this is the declaration of one of the victims. And she explains how National City Puppy, which is one of the stores, they claim to offer a rescue. So here's the photo she saw on the website. And then it stated on the website that the shelters are all local and they work with them to ensure the safety and happiness of our puppies. Now we exposed in discovery that none of the shelters that were so the way the scheme worked was that the puppy stores would use a provision in the law that required them to have a cooperative agreement with a shelter or rescue, and then that would allow them to sell dogs, which could include puppies, in the stores, but they still could not be from. So the law didn't require that the dogs actually come from the shelter where they had the cooperative agreement. They just had to have the cooperative agreement. They had to be working with a nonprofit that had a cooperative agreement with some shelter. So that's why they set up the fake Pet Connect Rescue, stealing our client, the real Pet Connect Rescue's name. And so they set up a Missouri corporation called Pet Connect Rescue, and then they would get these cooperative agreements with local shelters. Now, the law still required that the dogs or puppies could not come from brokers or breeders for compensation, but they would just kind of ignore that part, and they would claim that the puppies came from the shelters, but all of the puppies were in fact coming from the same puppy mill brokers and breeders in Missouri and Iowa that had always been supplying these stores. And then when animal control agencies would show up and ask questions, they would just waive the cooperative agreement and say, look, we have a nonprofit with a cooperative agreement at the end. And the agencies didn't look much further. And this is what it looked like inside the stores. You'd see rescue puppy written on the cage. They have in these glass cages that are like fish bowls, basically. They would keep the puppy. These are 10-week-old puppies they're shipping in. And then they would have these cage cards, which are required by law. In this case, it says Bark Adoptions. That was another fake rescue that they were using here. And they would list 10 weeks old, and they have but before the law took effect, it would state the name of the breeder, but now they're actually telling people that these are rescues. And so we see more examples of that. Here's one where Pet Connect Rescue in Joplin, Missouri is listed as the source of this particular puppy. So that's one. They also had a website that was basically just stock art. So this is another witness who submitted a declaration, and this is they had actually a couple of websites. One was SoCal Puppy Adoptions, which is another fake rescue that they created, and then they had the Pet Connect Rescue, the fake Pet Connect Rescue website, which these are all just stock art with just if you read the language on here, it doesn't mean anything. It's just kind of like word salad that they put together to hit buzzwords about rescuing animals. And they would talk about its fake history and their commitment to animals and that kind of thing. So it was all just a sham. And ultimately, we did get the documents and discovery showing. Here's the 1,288 pages of acquisition and disposition reports from Pet Connect Rescue, which is their fake Pet Connect Rescue. And this is through a company called the Pet Exchange, which was set up by Richard and Russell Kirk out of Iowa. And it's a database that allows them to launder puppies. So you can see the fancy puppy is one of the David Salinas stores on here. The vendors, this is choice puppies. And this is this is the list of all the puppies that were sold under the label Pet Connect Rescue. It just goes on and on for over 1,000 pages, and there's about 6,000 sales in here. So none of these puppies were from local rescue. So ultimately, we got a jury verdict. This was in the federal trademark case, and there was a $383,000 judgment against David Salinas on the sale, the retail sale side, and then a $3.5 million judgment against Ray Rothman, who set up the fake Pet Connect Rescue, and he works for Select Puppies. So he was doing this through Select Puppies, and he set up this other entity called RAK Transport, and he would invoice the stores. So we now have hundreds of pages of invoices where he would invoice the stores for what he called transportation costs, but it's thousands of dollars. So it was several $100s per puppy. So like, for instance, here, broker delivery for 6 pups rate $830 each, amount $4,980, and it just goes on and on and on. So he's selling the puppies essentially for the same amount as before, but listing that as a transport cost. So the judgment against him is for 3.5 million. Now he's down in Missouri, and then Select Puppies, his employer, is based in Iowa. So I know I'm in San Diego. This CLE is being hosted out of Chicago. And so there may be folks on here who have contacts that would be able to connect me up with somebody that can help with enforcement of some of these judgments, because these are pretty shady individuals, and once they are in another state, if it was here in California, then there's steps that could be immediately taken in California to enforce those judgments. But when they're in other states, then you've got to get local counsel to file a new case there, essentially, or record the judgment there, and then take steps to enforce it there. And so if folks have any contacts with attorneys in that practice in Missouri and or Iowa, want to help collect some of this money that the puppy millers owe to the real Peckneck Rescue, definitely send me an email or get in touch. We still have a pending in against David Salinas on behalf of defrauded consumers. The Animal Legal Defense Fund is doing a similar class action against some of the other puppy millers in the Central District of California. Our class action is pending here in the Southern District, which is based in San Diego. So this is all based on this fraud that occurred back in 2019, 2020, where thousands of consumers were defrauded. And we already finished the trademark case, which is one where we got the judgment on behalf of the real Peckneck Rescue. But these cases can go on for quite some time, and then once we win, then we have to then turn around and enforce the judgment. So this is a declaration from Chris Parrott, who is one of the he is an undercover investigator who worked. He works for all kinds of different animal groups, and you probably know him he's been involved for decades, exposing a lot of bad stuff. There's the HBO documentary Dealing Dogs. He wrote a book called Rescue Dogs, and he worked for Companion Animal Protection Society at the time of when this was going on, and actually went to a lot of these puppy mills. So he actually testified at the trial, and he was able to state exactly what he witnessed at these puppy mills that were in fact supplying the stores. But he also did investigations of some of the puppy stores. And so this is one of the declarations that he signed in the case, where he went to one of the Utah stores, and he saw, and this is one of the stores owned by David Salinas, and the employee told him, yeah, we shipped the puppies back and forth, and he had a hidden camera and recorded the conversation. We ship the puppies back and forth between the states, and if they're sold in California, we just have to take off the breeder information and replace it with rescue. And if they're sold here in Utah, then we list the breeder information as usual. So basically just admitting that just exactly how the scheme worked, which wasn't really much of a scheme. It was just fraud. I mean, it was just straight up fraud. It wasn't a complicated scam or anything like that. They were just removing breeder information, replacing it with rescue, and the end. And they were able to do that for about a year, which I was shocked that enforcement agencies and local authorities that had the ability to shut down this scam didn't put a stop to it. So that's why I filed the unfair business practices case and got the preliminary injunction, two preliminary injunctions, shutting down ultimately all of the stores about 6 months before there was then a legislative change that put a number of additional restrictions on what pet stores could do, and actually outright banned the sale of dogs in pet stores, but allowed rescue groups to display to hold adoption events essentially. But before any of that happened, the law as it was written could have and should have been enforced as it was written, and I was able to get injunctions under the unfair business practices statute here, which the way that works is we have, it's the Business and Professions Code, section 17200. It's another very powerful law that California has to hold corporations accountable, and it applies to any business that's violating any law. And if there's a consumer who's been defrauded as a result of the unfair business practices, or in the case of some of the nonprofits that I work with and represent, if an organization has been forced to divert its resources in dealing with unlawful acts that impact the organization's mission and that cause frustration of the organization's purpose and cause economic harm to the organization as a result of the unfair business practices, then the organization also has standing to bring suit. And you're not directly enforcing the law, but what you're doing is seeking an injunction from the court, and there's broad equitable relief available. So the wording of the statute is very broad and gives the court broad sweeping authority to issue any orders that are necessary to enjoin unlawful business practices wherever they occur. It can include appointing a receiver if necessary. But what we were after was just an injunction to stop the unlawful acts. And we got the preliminary injunction, and then the stores closed down and left the state. And that ended up mooting out the case. So we didn't need to have a trial in the state court cases, but we brought attorney fee motions at the end. And those attorney fee motions were granted, and now we're working on enforcing those judgments as well. So another unlawful business practice case that I'm bringing, and this can be a good segue into the community cat case and the issues surrounding that, and then we'll leave about 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. There's, for the first time in its 20-year history, the stadium here in San Diego called Petco Park, ironically enough, which Petco Park has the naming, Petco has the naming rights for the stadium, but they don't actually own it. It's owned by the city, and there's a joint use management agreement with the San Diego Padres, which is our professional baseball team here. For the first time in its 20-year history at Petco Park, the San Diego Padres decided to host a rodeo starting in 2024. They had another one, and they're doing this annually now, every January. So on behalf of Animal Protection and Rescue League, which is the local grassroots nonprofit that I run, as well as Showing Animals Respect and Kindness, or SHARK, which is an Illinois corporation that does a ton of work on rodeos, not just rodeos, but exposing illegal cockfighting and bullfighting, all kinds of, they go after all kinds of abuse of animals in entertainment. We brought suit, again, under the unfair business practices statute, and this case is still pending. And there was some zoning. So I'm just scrolling down through the complaint here. There's some zoning issues about cattle not being allowed in the Petco Park, but we went through and documented exactly what was happening in this rodeo. And so we've got screenshots in the complaint of typical rodeo events where the calves are being lassoed and roped back by the neck and tackled, and just all kinds of horrible stuff that people when people think of a rodeo, unless they actually have been to one, I don't think they know exactly what goes on at these things. But it is just nothing more than animal abuse. And so we outline this in the complaint. There was a horse that ran full speed into a fence at the 2024 rodeo. I recently deposed, and that horse never walked again, but they've of course been going around saying the horse is fine, everything's fine. So the horse belonged to uh, an indigenous family in North Dakota that had come down. There's an event called the Indigenous Relay Race. It was held at the end of the at the rodeo in 2024, and they basically just shipped the horse out of here dead or dying, and claimed that there had been X-rays showing that the horse didn't have any fractures. But in deposition, the veterinarian for the rodeo, who's an inside guy, admitted that in fact the X-rays supposedly didn't even work, and what he meant by there being no X-rays was just that the X-rays, or what he meant by no X-rays showing any fractures, he meant that the X-rays didn't actually work, and so they don't have any proof one way or the other. Um, so that's ongoing, and then more recently uh, in 2025, there was a pregnant horse that was used in the saddle bronc event, which is when, in order to get the horses to buck wildly, they use this tight bucking strap around the abdomens. And this horse was in a very late term of pregnancy and then died shortly thereafter from internal bleeding. So San Diego Humane Society, which we'll talk about in a minute in the cat case, is supposed to be investigating. They have people at these events. They're supposed to be enforcing animal cruelty laws. Not only are they not enforcing this type of thing as animal cruelty, but when I issued a subpoena for all records regarding that horse who died, I get these responses from their head of law enforcement saying that because they're not only they're not going to file criminal charges, but they're going to cover up who did it, and they're not going to even allow us to see who the owner of the horse was or critical witness information. So we know who the owner of the horse was, and we've got some of this information already. But just the willingness of San Diego Humane Society to be complicit and to cover up, and they're represented always by these big firms. So Shepherd Mullen stepped in, and they're saying, they're not going to provide the records. And so there's all this need to confer communication. But here's the records they did provide, heavily redacted and blanking out critical witness information, just on and on and on. So we have a pending motion to compel. We're going to get all of this information. And they've got the investigators follow-up report where they have Tim Eastman, who's the rodeo veterinarian. He's on the board of the Salinas rodeo, and he's just a rodeo insider. So they brought him all the way down from Salinas, California, which is about a 6-hour drive, when they could have had how many veterinarians just in the local vicinity, that because they're required by law to have an on-call veterinarian. So they wanted to have this inside guy that could sign off on things. They've got Jed Pugsley, their rodeo livestock welfare manager. His job seems to be working as a firefighter and other things in southern Utah, and then for some reason he's in charge of the whole event for the San Diego Padres rodeo. And then the company that puts on the rodeo is C5 Rodeo Company, that's based out of Montana. So they're all coming in here to San Diego and just engaging in this spectacle of animal abuse. And then we've got the local agency that's covering up what's actually occurring here. And ironically, at the same time, San Diego Humane Society is saying that they're against rodeos, they would support a ban on rodeos, but this enables them to kind of do two things at once. They can raise funds and tell their donors that, look, they're doing something, but then at the same time, they can appease the Padres and the city and whoever else that they're not actually going to enforce the laws that are on the books, kind of like exactly what they did in the puppy mill cases. So I think a lot of this information was included in the CLE materials, but if anything's missing or anybody wants, and then here's an unredacted version of the necropsy report that we're able to get from another source, and you can see that, so Tim Eastman, they billed the necropsy to his Steinbeck Peninsula Equine Clinic. So the question arises of who is paying for this necropsy, who ordered it, but it's the rodeo that's doing it. It's not this just independent thing that was happening. So we're uncovering all of that in discovery. Um, so switching now to the issue with the community cats. Um, the issue there was both. So we had a lot of witnesses who testified that they had done community cat rescue. They had done trap neuter release of feral cats, and they've done um, animal rescue for many years. And there was a shift that happened not only at San Diego Humane Society, but we also have learned from other agencies that this is being pushed in different areas uh, around the state and around the country. Was that friendly adoptable cats and cats that weren't part of any feral colony, and they weren't feral at all, were suddenly being just re-released by the agency. And this was alarming to a lot of people. And then we had individuals and small grassroots nonprofits that were impacted by this, because all of a sudden they're having to spend their own funds and resources trying to scramble and figure out what to do with these cats that are being dumped by the agency that's being paid tens of millions of dollars in taxpayer funding to provide shelter and adoption services. So the case again was brought under unfair business practices because San Diego Humane Society, while it has over a dozen municipal contracts, it's also a privately funded nonprofit, and they raise funds to rescue animals and to run their shelter and everything else that they do. And so we sought both declaratory relief and injunctive relief to stop the release of cats that were friendly and adoptable. And then in the past, it always, in a typical trap neuter release scenario, when feral cat trappers are out there, if a friendly cat comes in, they'll try to find that cat a home. But in this case, San Diego Humane Society was deciding that the friendly cats should just go right back out there, and whatever happens. We have a lot of coyotes, we have a lot of canyons with coyotes in San Diego. There's of course highways and cars that cats get hit by cars a lot. They get eaten by coyotes. So the issue in this case was that the cats that were being released, these friendly adoptable cats, there was no monitoring, there's no follow-up, no microchipping, there's no confirmed caretakers. So we wanted the court, and ultimately what the court ordered, and we're still working out the final terms of the judgment and the final statement of decision, but what the court indicated was if you're releasing cats without a known caretaker, then that is abandonment, because you have no idea what's happening to that cat. And how can the agents required by law to take these cats in? And then there's specific requirements for there's a hold period, and then for the owner reclaim, as well as for the cat to have an opportunity to be adopted after that. And if they're just immediately putting these cats back out on the street with no follow-up, no monitoring, they don't know what's happening with these cats, that's illegal abandonment. One of the exhibits in the case, which I thought was pretty illuminating, this was an email. This is one of the trial exhibits, and there was an incident with a cat named Mango that kind of blew up on social media because it was one of these friendly adoptable cats that the San Diego Humane Society put back on the street, and then ended up, nobody knows how the cat died, but it ended up with a gash, or was found dead with a wound. And so people were kind of up, and this was just one example. There are a number of examples like this, but with this particular example, which was back in 2020, the head of San Diego Humane Society, who's Dr. Gary Weitzman, issued a directive to senior leadership and said, okay, here's what we're going to do here. And he has in bold, until we're sure that all cats we care for have a safe pathway, we will not return friendly community cats to an outdoor environment unless that cat is fully supported by a known caretaker. So that's pretty much exactly what we were asking for in the case. And you see here that he states that that distinction with friendly, they know, and the law actually has criteria for distinction between friendly and feral. And they were able to do this back in 2020 when they first started rolling out this program, where they said, okay, we're gonna do this trap neuter release trap neuter return for cats that are brought to us. Essentially, they wanted to set up their own trap neuter return program, which typically animal control agencies and shelters wouldn't be involved in that directly. They would maybe facilitate, and you have groups of feral cat groups that do the trap neuter return, and the agency would just be releasing the cat to those nonprofits, which they're allowed to do by law, and then the nonprofits would then ensure that they're releasing them in a safe manner. There's a colony or something like that, but it's up to the nonprofit at that point. But when we had this shift, 2019, 2020, when San Diego Humane Society decided that they're going to do this directly, they decided they're going to do this for all cats, regardless of feral or friendly. But they were able to roll it back. They realized they'd gone too far, and they shouldn't be releasing these friendly cats to an outdoor environment without a known caretaker. And then he lists a couple of criteria. And then there's some pushback from the head of shelter medicine, who also works with Dr. Kate Hurley, who is the expert witness called by San Diego Humane Society, who's based out of UC Davis and has been putting a lot of the kind of academic basis out there for why they're doing this. And their head of shelter medicine is basically pushing back internally and saying it should be all or nothing. We shouldn't let this one incident cause us to upend the whole program. And Dr. Weissman said, don't worry, this is temporary until we can officially start the program and understand it, address liability, make sure the board is on board. And that's in fact what they did. They ended up then going back to what they were doing originally when they started rolling out this program, which was to be releasing all cats unless the cat had what they called verifiable evidence of ownership. And that ended up being a key point in the case, because all sides agreed that if a cat is truly stray or abandoned, that by law, as well as under their contractual obligations and just their own policies, that San Diego Humane Society would need to bring that cat into the shelter, but they were requiring quote unquote verifiable proof that the cat was owned or had been stray or abandoned. So essentially, unless a cat came in wearing a collar or had a microchip, or somebody had actually literally seen the cat being abandoned, somebody dumping the cat somewhere and leaving, then they were going to assume that if the cat came in with a good body condition score, that was evidence that the cat was unowned and living successfully outdoors. And of course, they have no idea how long that cat had been seen in the area, and if the cat had been just abandoned there. But unless they had what they call verifiable proof of abandonment, or that the cat was stray, they would then put the cat back out there. And on cross-examination, their expert testified that actually might be too high of a standard, and that it shouldn't be verifiable proof. But if there's a reasonable belief that the cat was stray or abandoned, then that should be enough to admit the cat into the shelter. An example was if a cat was previously spayed or neutered and did not have an ear tip. So an ear tip is where a portion of the top of the ear is removed, and that has historically been done, and it's done under anesthesia. It's historically been done as part of the spay and neuter process for feral cats, so then you don't retrap that same cat or stress the cat out. But if the cat ends up in a trap, the cat's going to be stressed out in the trap, taken to the shelter and all this, to be spayed or neutered, when you can see the cat's already been spayed or neutered based on the ear tip. So if a cat has an ear tip, that has historically been an indication that that's a feral cat that's already been spayed or neutered. But what San Diego Humane Society was doing, if somebody brings a cat in that they find outside that's already spayed or neutered but does not have an ear tip, so that indicates that a private veterinarian or something that was not a trap neuter release group spayed or neutered that cat. The cat clearly had an owner at some point, but they would still consider that to be an unknown cat unless there's some other verifiable proof of ownership. And so that ended up being another thing that the court said that needs to change as well. That if a cat comes in spayed or neutered without an ear tip, that's an indication of ownership. So we're kind of in the minutia of the exact details of what the wording of the final order is going to say. But we did win the case. The court found that that San Diego Humane Society was unlawfully releasing cats without caretakers and in violation of abandonment laws. And one of the things that comes up in cases like this is you're able to conduct expert discovery. And so this was one of the versions of the declaration of Dr. Kate Hurley, who is our expert. And we were able to see all these edits in here that were that all in each of these different colors represent different attorneys. San Diego Humane Society was represented by O'Melveny and Myers, which is a $1 billion law firm. They were actually based out of San Francisco. And so there are all these edits where they were going through and saying, well, let's not say that, and let's say this, and basically telling her certain things and to make their argument more compelling. But essentially her declaration was giving her opinion that as somebody who's read different literature and had experience in the field, that if a cat is found outside in good body condition, that's an indication that the cat's doing well and should essentially be left alone. Now it ended up being more of like a policy preference that Dr. Hurley as well as San Diego Humane Society have, which they would actually prefer that the cats be left outdoors, even if this is a known cat, because they actually believe that the cat's more likely to be reunited with the owner, or will find other means of people to care for the cat. They don't want the cats in the shelter because it's the typical reasons: shelter overcrowding and euthanasia. But if you're just outsourcing your euthanasia program to coyotes and vehicles and starvation, then that's not a good program, and it violates the law. So that's what the core of our case was about. And it wasn't to stop. There's been a lot of misinformation that the case was to stop all trap, neuter, return of feral cats or any cats, and that's not what the case was about at all. It was about the friendly, adoptable cats, which, as we saw in that internal communication, they very well know how to make that distinction. And it was also about cats that they admit under their own policies should be admitted into the shelter, and under the law must be admitted into the shelter, but that they were creating certain criteria that would make it virtually impossible for these cats to actually be admitted into the shelter unless there was this insurmountable verifiable proof. Like another example is they would say, if you saw a cat being dumped if a cat was found in a cardboard box, like in a parking lot or something, that's evidence the cat was abandoned because the cat's confined in this box. Okay, well, what if somebody dumped the cat in the same parking lot but didn't leave the cat in a box? Then well, there's no evidence in that case. So then San Diego Humane Society would say, okay, put the cat back in the parking lot. So it ended up just being, they were looking for any ways that they could deny friendly adoptable cats shelter and adoption services, and instead just put those cats back out there and hope for the best. So I'm sure folks have questions, and we've got about 15 minutes left. So why don't we open it up at this point, because I've been jumping around a lot here. Let's see what people want to hear.
Thank you very much, Bryan. Very interesting talk. Attendees, please put your questions in the chat and I will convey them to Bryan. I have a question to start out. I know you've been successful in recovering attorney's fees and damages against the puppy millers. Are you able to actually recover those amounts, get money in hand?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was kind of throwing out a request here, that if folks do know anybody in the Midwest there that can help with judgment collection, that would be very helpful, because we are, as of now, with this most recent, with this larger judgment, they haven't paid a dime. So we're working on enforcement at this time. And David Salinas is operating, he has a company called Cedar Pet Supply, and so he has puppy stores in Utah and Nevada. So we're working on getting judgments recorded there, but he does it under a series of shell corporations. It was the same thing in California, where he would kind of hide behind the series of shell corporations, so that he would claim that whenever it suited him, he would claim he wasn't the owner, he just worked there or whatever. But we're getting to the bottom of the shell game, and he does have puppy stores. There are the puppy millers in Missouri and Iowa that have the judgments that are still operating there, and through Select Puppies and supplying puppy stores around the country. So yeah, so to answer the question, yes, early on there were some other bad actors that settled out early on, and we did get fees that way through settlement. So they stopped what they were doing and they paid fees at that time. These particular defendants who have much larger judgments against them have not paid anything on those judgments, and we're moving forward with enforcement. So that's, yeah, we have outstanding judgments that need to be enforced.
I have a question from an attendee asking, have you ever worked in cases involving exotic animals?
Well, I have a pending case against, we had in 2022, I think it was, we had a kind of a perennial candidate here for governor named John H. Cox, who then at that time was running in the recall election against the California governor Gavin Newsom, and he hired a company called Steve Martin's Working Wildlife, no relation to the actor. But he would go on tour around the state with a 1,000-pound bear that he would have there, and then he had his campaign bus emblazoned with a logo that called himself Beast John Cox, and then so he's basically just using the bear as a publicity sign, as a prop. And in San Diego, believe it or not, we have an ordinance that says you can't have bears in the city of San Diego. So I brought an unfair business practice case against him and against Steve Martin's Working Wildlife. And then, of course, the recall was not successful, and he hasn't run again. So he hasn't done this since. But the case is actually still pending. We're trying to determine at this point if it's something where we would dismiss for mootness and then move for attorney's fees, or if we still want to get some kind of injunctive relief, particularly with respect to the entity that brought the bear. But yeah, sometimes I do work on cases that involve exotic animals as opposed to dogs and cats.
Another question from a viewer, under what law did you sue the Padres for the rodeo?
Oh, sure. So that was, again, unfair business practices, and the specific. So what's required for the unfair business practices statute is it invokes any other law that's being violated, and they're called predicate offenses that form the basis for the unfair business practices that you're seeking the injunction to stop. And so the predicate offenses, in addition to zoning code violations, which were still that's more of a legal question as to whether the zoning codes apply. There's a broader issue of unlawful animal cruelty under Penal Code 597. That's our general animal cruelty law here in California. That's the general animal cruelty law, and then there's some other more specific laws that they were violating with respect to the handling and the treatment of the animals. So it's essentially it's an animal cruelty case, but it's through the unfair business practices statute seeking an injunction to stop them from doing these things that constitute unlawful animal cruelty.
Okay, that may answer the next question, which was, how did you use the unfair business practices claim for the community cat cases?
Yeah, so in that case, it was again, it was an animal cruelty law that was being violated, and it was Penal Code 597S, which is animal abandonment. So it was a penal code that was being violated by the agency that's supposed to be enforcing animal cruelty law. So if a person just went out there and just they're like, oh, I don't want this cat anymore, and just throw the cat out in the parking lot somewhere, they would be arrested for animal cruelty by the agency, that's now doing exactly what they should be enforcing, or what they would be enforcing if an individual did that. And there are also specific provisions in the Civil Code 1815, 1916, about the specific requirements that if a dog or a cat is brought to an animal shelter like this, that that they then need to take the animal in. So, but because it's kind of this hybrid of where they're the animal control agency due to the municipal contract, but they're also a private entity. So they're a nonprofit that they raise, in addition to the tens of millions in taxpayer funds that they get hundreds of millions in private donations. And before they had those municipal contracts, they were running they were also running shelter and adoption services. So as a business, it's a non-profit business, but the unfair business practice statute applies to nonprofits as well as for-profit businesses. So that was the basis for using that law.
Someone asks whether you have any suggestions how people can best draw attention to these topics.
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Yes. How can people best draw attention to these topics?
Oh, well, that's a good question, because there's all kinds of ways to try to put pressure on policymakers. I've kind of given up on, I don't want to demoralize anyone, but and I do believe in political organizing and getting involved in local organizing efforts. Of course, there's typical means like protesting and speaking out at meetings and things like that. But I've kind of, I mean, maybe I've become more cynical. I used to think that you could shame public officials, and that if they're exposed in what they're doing, they won't want to be seen in that light anymore, and so maybe they'll reform some of their behaviors. But what I've found more and more, maybe it's a symptom of kind of where things are at in this country politically, and where people just double down on just nonsense. I've seen
Mhm.
officials just kind of like, they don't even try to do spin control. I mean, they just shrug it off, and just it's like they're shameless. I mean, I've really just turned to the courts to seek remedies that way. So I guess my answer is I don't know. To do what you can, and if you find something that works, let me know.
Thank you. Someone has asked, what can be done for animals in Illinois where we do not have the same Unfair Business Practices Act as California?
That I don't know. I see Sherry Travis is one of the attorneys that's in the audience right now, and she's a good one to talk to because she's had a lot of experience in this realm, has done a lot of work in that realm. I'm not an Illinois attorney, so I don't have I don't know what can be done in Illinois.
Another person has asked, when interpreting the cruelty statute on abandonment, how does one distinguish friendly versus feral cats?
Well, so that that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, because that's not a distinction that's found in the law with respect to abandonment. So at least the way that the California statutes are written, it's pretty specific. We do have there are specific there is criteria to distinguish between friendly and feral, and there's a different holding period that applies to each, and there's different protocols for what you have to do with a friendly versus a feral cat. So that distinction is in the law. But as far as just releasing the cat to the street, that's illegal no matter what. It doesn't matter if the cat's friendly or feral. So this is where we're kind of trying to strike this delicate balance, because we, as a plaintiff, so I was representing Pet Assistance Foundation, which is a nonprofit that brought this case, as well as individuals who are impacted by the policies. We didn't want to go after the release of feral cats, particularly if it's being done in a responsible manner. So we didn't challenge that. That wasn't part of what we challenged. It wasn't what we asked for relief regarding. But if you're looking at the way the law is actually worded and what their responsibilities are, even a feral cat, they can't just release the cat to the streets. What they are allowed to do under law is transfer that cat to a nonprofit. So that's traditionally what had been done, is if an agency wanted to support a feral cat program, they would transfer the cat to the nonprofit, which would then be able to do that. But as far as making that distinction and who the agency is going to actually just directly release, we tried to kind of phrase it in the negative. It wasn't like we weren't saying, yeah, go ahead and release, any particular cat. We were just saying this case is challenging the release of these friendly adoptable cats that previously you weren't releasing, and now you're suddenly just putting them on the street, and that needs to stop. So that's all we were asking for, but we didn't want to get into the micromanaging of how they would actually manage the program or make these determinations.
Why do you think public bodies are so reluctant to execute their duties in protecting animals?
I have no idea. It's extremely frustrating and enraging that the people that are supposed to be in charge of enforcing these laws are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, we see the same thing in the regulatory field with what's known as regulatory capture or agency capture, where a corporation that's supposed to be regulated kind of takes over the agency, and they're all buddies, and they kind of go along to get along. So I mean, there's some of that going on, but I mean, we also see it with government agencies in the housing realm and other areas where it's like there's this mentality of government, and I don't want to feed into some of the other stuff that's going on politically at the national level, but I don't think government is bad or the enemy. I think government is in fact the solution to a lot of these problems. But then what we actually see in practice is a lot of the people that are charged with enforcement just aren't doing their jobs, and whether it's incompetence or laziness or malice, it doesn't matter. At the end, it's the animals who suffer. So what needs to happen, we need greater transparency and accountability and oversight. And as far as what the motivations are of the people that aren't doing their jobs, yeah, I mean, unless they're being held accountable, I guess they're gonna take the easy path.
Hmm. Regarding the rodeos, do you run into any concerns from the Mexican American community that this is part of their cultural heritage and it's kind of an attack if there's an attack on rodeos?
So there has been some of that, and it's kind of interesting because if you look at the talking points that are put out there, um, it's kind of weird because the Western rodeos that were targeting, well, in particular the Padres rodeo, but there are other similar rodeos that go on all over. And I know Shark, the group that I mentioned, does do a lot with the Mexican rodeos and the charreadas and the just really horrible stuff that happens at those rodeos. What's interesting is that the practices that happen at the Mexican rodeos and the charreadas are worse. They're more illegal. It's underground. They're not doing this. It's hard to find these things. So, but what's interesting is in the talking points when we're targeting the Western rodeos, they like to trot out these cultural arguments, say, "Oh, look, it's cultural and heritage," but it's all about like dancing and concerts and stuff having not or displays of things that have nothing to do with the animal abuse. It's just here's this culture and heritage on display. But my view of it is, okay, you want to talk about the Mexican rodeos, let's look at the Mexican rodeos and what's going on, because that's not a reason to not stop the Western rodeos. What's happening at the Mexican rodeos, if we uncover that and get to the bottom of that, that's an even worse and more extreme thing if they would talk about what's actually going on at those events. And so yeah, we have had some pushback, but it's been this kind of like surface level fluff, and not actually pointing out here are the specific things that happen at Mexican rodeos. And if people saw that, they wouldn't say, "Oh yeah, we should be doing that. Like let's let them keep doing it." Like nobody thinks they should be able to keep doing that. That's why they're hiding it, doing it underground. So
Hmm. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you again, Brian, for being here. Very, very thought-provoking presentation. I know I learned a lot from it. And thank you to the audience for attending today. Please submit any feedback to Brett Davinger. And I wish you all a good afternoon.